Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's August 1st, 2025. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host, Ness.
The next mayor of New York City celebrated his nuptials with a lavish 3-day affair at his family's ritzy, secluded Ugandan compound, according to the New York Post, which includes pictures of gates of the bustling private compound worth well into the seven figures. And this is in a country where the purchasing power parity per capita, effectively the median income, is a hair under $3,900. That compares to the PPP per capita in the United States of $60,000. And so the American to Ugandan comparison, Americans make about 20 times as much per year as Ugandans. So to put this in perspective, even if we take the very low end of the estimate of the value of the compound, that would be comparable to a compound in the United States valued at over $50 million. That's how much better off Mamdani's family is than the people he lives around. And this is someone who is running a socialist campaign, and it might sound like Boomer Con, Fox News style, clickbaity content to talk about this, but it is crucially important to understand how ungenuine and insincere this approach is. It is, as we have talked about previously, prime illustration of market dominant minorities figuring out how to exploit a system and utilize it to benefit themselves. And that's exactly what he's doing here. He's hawking a sort of socialism that is going to make him, whether or not he does any good for the country, he is going to do quite well indeed from it. So I think it's worth taking a moment to understand that this isn't just some sort of goofy socialism that's being advocated by clowns who don't understand economics. It's much deeper than that, and I think fundamentally more evil and misanthropic. I recall in 2015, a musician that I'm a fan of, Dave Matthews, talking with reference to the Bernie Sanders campaign about how Dave Matthews self-described as a liberal Democrat at the time and said he wished he could be a socialist, and he admired Bernie Sanders for being a socialist, but he couldn't quite get there himself, as if it was some sort of moral failing, that he wanted to get to that point, but he couldn't. And so he wanted to vote for someone else who would essentially force the society to change in that direction because he couldn't do it. And this is coming from someone who is one of the most successful touring acts in history with a net worth approaching $1 billion, and who is an avowed political leftist. And despite all of that, he still can't voluntarily bring himself to do what he putatively says he thinks should be done politically. He could cut 99% of his net worth away and still live better than 99.9% of the people on the planet, and yet he won't do that voluntarily. But he wants to create a political system that forces people who are much, much less well off than him to be unable to climb up the economic ladder, even one rung of the 1,000-rung ladder that he has climbed up on. And Mamdani has the same sort of orientation. A lot of these market-dominant minority types, and in the case of Dave Matthews, obviously he was, or maybe not obviously, but he is South African. He is European-descended South African. So whites in South Africa are very much a market-dominant minority. This is a pattern that when you become aware of it and you start looking at it, you see it play out over and over again. So I would counsel against having an orientation towards this type of belief as something that is just silly and a little bit head in the clouds, good intentioned, but perhaps having a little bit too much of an expansive understanding and view of the world, and instead look at it at what it is at its essence, which is a sort of authoritarian kicking away the ladder for people, for the vast majority of the population. This is the mindset that leads to the sort of Peronist Argentinian style of society, and then eventually even to the Soviet style of Joseph Stalin. Mamdani's father is a professor who has an emphasis in post-colonial studies, which, as Jeff has mentioned previously, is effectively translated as white people bad, white expansionism bad, white imperialism bad. Yet in this New York Post article, there is a picture from outside of the compound. The compound is gated with high walls and concertina wire around the tops, and there are two very dark-skinned sub-Saharan African guards keeping the local population out. If this doesn't evoke images of colonialism, I don't know what would. And in some sense, you can say good for him for figuring out how to be the new colonialists. But the important takeaway here is to not take them seriously. Do not think that they actually want to go to the logical end of what they purport to support. And as far as what exactly that support putatively is towards, well, what it is not towards, or what it shouldn't be towards, if you hear them describe it in a political stump speech setting, is a situation where you have a family compound that has a net value that's 5,000 times the average annual salary of the population that lives there. Why not take 90% of your net worth, which would still leave you at 500 times wealthier than the people, the native Ugandans who live there, to pay, instead of those guards $3,000 a year, to pay them $30,000 a year, to pay them a, quote, livable wage, unquote. But instead you fly people in from all over the world. Note the obvious environmental degradation that cost. Flying Mamdani across the ocean means that he has kicked up more CO2 than I probably will in my entire life as someone who is quite a homebody. For a garish wedding and weddings, the excess and the glitz and the glamour and the unnecessary consumption that goes on there, it's really the perfect epitomization of what people like Mamdani and what these market-dominant minorities tend to be about. Their public protestations notwithstanding.
This is a prime example of luxury beliefs. That's a topic we explored in a previous episode. Briefly stated, it's a belief a belief or a moral stance that acts as a status symbol for wealthy or socially privileged people. These beliefs cost little to the people who hold them, but can impose costs or risks on less privileged people. So the big example I give, the main example I think of, is a wealthy person advocating for defunding the police while living in a safe gated neighborhood, having private security. And so Mamdani will have no problem leaving a gated compound guarded by armed sub-Saharans and flying right back to New York City and talking about how New York City needs to defund the police and that there are too many guns in society. And I don't think he'll bat an eye. I don't think he'll recognize any sort of contradiction between his actions and his stated beliefs. And Mamdani's obviously following in the footsteps of Bernie Sanders and AOC to some extent. They are all self-described democratic socialists. And Bernie Sanders famously used to, in his demagogic speeches where he went after the millionaires and billionaires, well, he used to go after millionaires. And you'll notice that he only goes after billionaires now. And it seems to have roughly coincided to when he himself became a millionaire, and he owns either 2 or 3 houses. And so Mamdani, in the same vein, talks about how appalling the wealth inequality is in the United States, while, again, having no problem living in easily the top 1% in Uganda. And Mamdani you look at him, for an Indian, for a subcontinental, he's very light-skinned. I would say well, probably in the 20th, 30th percentile towards the lighter end of the skin spectrum. And that seems perfectly appropriate because traditionally the upper caste in India is obviously historically very caste-based society. The Brahmins or the upper caste were typically much more lighter skinned than the lower caste individuals who typically had much darker skin. And I'm reminded of an incident I witnessed when I was in India. I was at a middle-class but relatively well-off Indian residence, and this decrepit old woman would come in regularly to sweep the floor and clean the household. And she maintained a friendly relationship with the owners of the residence. And one evening I was there, and she came in, not on job duty, just purely to socialize. And I remember seeing her. We were just gathered in a living room, and she came in and sat on the floor, and there were plenty of chairs available. And this struck me as odd, and I was told that's just how it is. The certain caste, there's very clear roles, and certain people do some things and other people do others, and that's just how it is. And based on Mamdani's wedding, I think he would be very comfortable with that sort of arrangement. At the same time, I'm sure he would be equally comfortable giving a long, emotional speech on how appalling the caste system is and how India's made a lot of progress, but it still has a lot of work to do to deal with the inequities and inequalities in society.
That is, of course, what the managerial elite, the managerial state, and the managers who run that state exist to do, to become wealthy elites managing that system, never solving the problems. There is always more work to be done, but feathering their own nests in the process to become the most powerful and influential elites in society, while always talking about the problems but never ameliorating any of them. New York City is one of the most unequal places in the United States, far more unequal economically and in terms of status and privilege than the flyover country that Mamdani supporters tend to look down upon. Before we leave this behind, I do want to add a little clarification to why I opened the segment by talking about Mamdani as the future mayor of New York City, given that I have previously expressed some hesitancy to necessarily crown him the next mayor. But looking at Polymarket, the market for Mamdani challengers has collapsed, and Mamdani is now more than a 4-to-1 favorite to become the next mayor. His shares are trading at 82 cents on the dollar. When we talked about this last time, he was under 70%. And Cuomo and Adams were both around 15% at the time. Both of them have collapsed down to single digits, and Mamdani has taken all of that momentum and moved to the top. And I think that, without having followed it closely, the primary reason is that as of now, both Cuomo and Adams plan to run. And so if there's any chance of Mamdani being defeated, it would have to be with all of the establishment getting behind one of those two people. But if they both run, the idea that either one of them will be able to overcome the split in the opposition vote and beat Mamdani's strong base of support seems, well, a real shot, a real Hail Mary, and the betting markets reflect that now.
Mamdani's inconsistency, contradictions, hypocrisy, inconsistency between his stated beliefs and his lived reality brought to mind other contradictions that I've noticed as I've grown up, contradictions in historical narratives, religious narratives, American narratives. And young Americans are raised to revere certain historical or religious texts and figures, only to find contradictions when they explore those sources directly. So I'm going to give a few examples. Hopefully will make this concept clear. We'll take one of the larger Protestant faiths, Lutheranism. Presumably, if you're raised in a Lutheran household, you would be taught to revere the namesake of your denomination, Martin Luther. And if you're a precocious kid, you might be inclined to, if Martin Luther is presented as this amazing figure, I'm going to go read some of what Martin Luther wrote. And if you did that, you might come across his writings on Jews and how he thought they should be treated and their place in Christianity. And if you were to parrot what Martin Luther sincerely, apparently, believed about Jews, well, you would potentially now, with some of the anti-Semitism laws being passed in the United States under Trump, you could potentially be criminally charged or easily or certainly have your life ruined. Next, the Founding Fathers. Now, this is the Founding Fathers are coming under increasing attack over the decades, but I would say overall they're still taught as figures to, while perhaps their flaws are acknowledged, but they are taught they're presented as somebody to as figures to be respected. And again, if you read the founders, many of them, I would point particularly to Thomas Jefferson. Or not just Thomas Jefferson, any of the founders, if you read what they, again, sincerely, deeply believed about race and the relevance of the European heritage of America, you'll quickly realize how alien it sounds to modern ears, their beliefs about race and the role of white people versus the role of non-white people in American society.
I think that even that conception of how historical figures are presented in the United States is becoming a little bit quaint and a little bit antiquated, as we're moving now to a time where we're shifting from them being first heroes to being nuanced figures with flaws who still had a lot of good qualities about them, to where we'll shift in 5 or 10 years down the road to them potentially being conceived of as outright villains. But the point is still generally well taken, and I think the purpose for this is to create the vague perception that whatever current cultural sensibilities are, those current cultural sensibilities are not just novel inventions of current year elites and cultural shapers, but they actually have a historical foundation that shows that they are somehow time tested and that they have always been conceived of as the right way to do things, or at least going back in the past and looking into the future, they can be seen as on the road to progress. The saying that the arc of history bends towards justice. That's the purpose of a lot of these conceptions. And I think to really get at the essence of what Jeff was talking about, they don't want you to go back and read the primary sources. It's always the secondary sources. They want to be able to interpret these people and what distillation of their thought is important for today, but they do not want you to go back and read firsthand. And Jeff gave some examples that skew towards affinities that traditionalists and conservatives might lean in the direction of, but you can do this on the cultural left as well. Take the I effing love science crowd who treats Charles Darwin as some sort of enlightenment that it can be used as a cudgel to beat down religious superstition, and yet how many people who would celebrate Darwin and the triumph of science are aware of his most famous work, the full title of it being The Theory of Evolution by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, is often referred to, in addition to being the father of statistics, also the sort of godfather of eugenics, the eugenics movement. And so today, given the reigning cultural sensibilities, Darwin is useful as an attack force against traditional religions, specifically Christianity, but he is completely unuseful and harmful in terms of his understanding of biology, particularly how it relates to humans and human biodiversity. And so the secondary sources, when they talk about Darwin, they talk about the evolution of different species, but at the same time put no focus on how that biology and what Darwin discovered, what that has to say about humans now. And people are familiar with the theory of evolution by way of natural selection, but far fewer people are familiar with Darwin's subsequent work called The Descent of Man, where he takes his insights at a species level and looks at them and applies them to humanity and the various what he would conceive of as subspecies, or we might characterize as races of humans, and how humans differ biologically and evolutionary pressures have acted on humans in different ways. Here's a quote from Charles Darwin in The Descent of Man. Quote, "There is, however, no doubt that the various races, when carefully compared in measure, differ much from each other, as in the texture of the hair, the relative proportions of all parts of the body, the capacity of the lungs, the form and capacity of the skull, and even in the convolutions of the brain. But it would be an endless task to specify the numerous points of difference. The races differ also in constitution, in acclimatization, and in liability to certain diseases. Their mental characteristics are likewise very distinct, chiefly, as it would appear, in their emotional, but partly in their intellectual faculties. Every one who has had the opportunity of their comparison must have been struck with the contrast between the taciturn, even morose, aborigines of South America and the light-hearted, talkative Negroes. There is a nearly similar contrast between the Malays and the Papuans, who live under the same physical conditions and are separated from each other only by a narrow space of sea." Unquote. How many fedora-wearing, self-styled, enlightened atheists who put little legs on their mocking Jesus fish figurines would endorse that, as opposed to being horrified by it and canceling Darwin if it ever became widely known, even though, to get to Jeff's point, that information is available. It's 2 centuries in the public domain now. You can find The Descent of Man anywhere. This was his second most famous work after the first one that really put him on the historical map. And yet very, very few people are familiar with it because the secondary sources that have utility in presenting Darwin in a certain way to buttress, again, modern cultural sensibilities have no use for this. In fact, it is quite harmful. And so the secondary sources never mention it.
Without delving deep into Darwin and reading the primary sources, if you have just a basic conception of the theory of natural selection, that is, that organisms in particular environments react to those environments by adapting, and their genes are changed to better suit to survive in that environment, and those organisms that are not able to adapt adequately to the environment that they're in will die off. That theory, as Darwin applies it to organisms, to animals, to plants, if you don't even look at it in a nuanced way or a sophisticated way or come at it with a lot of scientific background, if you're just hearing that, it intuitively makes sense. And it intuitively, obviously, certainly would apply to the animal known as Homo sapien just as much as it would apply to wolves or any other animal, birds, finches, whatever. And so you have to be tricked or misled to come to believe that somehow this hero, Darwin, and his genius theory, it applies to every single organism on Earth except humans. It doesn't apply to humans.
Or if it is begrudgingly acknowledged that it does apply to humans, it's only in superficial ways, as if evolutionary pressures only affect things like eye color or melanin content in the skin or other superficial characteristics, but no way that evolutionary pressures would have any impact on, say, the brain, the single most important organ in terms of survival strategies. No, evolution wouldn't work on meaningful things like that. It only works on superficial things.
And really, if you take that idea that Ness just put forward, he put it forth facetiously, but it is, I believe, accurately describes, if you actually ask a leftist, I love science type, how they thought that theory would apply or not apply to humans. I think they would basically come down to describe what Ness just described. But really, if you think about it, then that just contradicts the whole theory of Darwin altogether. If you're saying that all of these selection pressures on humans, it actually doesn't matter. It's all of these selection theories are just cosmetic, just like in a video game, just putting on a different color suit doesn't have any effect on your stats or any sort of meaningful effect. Well, if that's certainly not what his whole point of Darwin's theories is that these are meaningful differences, and that these are differences that affect life and death and whether an organism or a group survives.
And to put it in more technical terminology, he is talking about things that increase or are detrimental to evolutionary fitness, and things that are totally trivial and merely cosmetic at most have some attenuated influence on sexual selection. But in terms of survivability, obviously things like personality and intelligence and visuospatial reasoning and language fluency are going to have more of an impact than whether or not one's eyes are green or brown or hazel.
Another contradiction I've always found puzzling is the intersection of two issues, that of immigration and environmentalism. Those are, for me, both. I consider those both extremely important issues, and it's so perplexing how almost exclusively the people in the self-described environmentalists, they also are open borders people who believe that immigration is a great thing and that enforcing immigration law in any sort of rigorous way is immoral, and that anyone from around the world has just as much moral claim on the territory of the United States as certainly as white people do. And yet what they're essentially saying is, on the one hand, they want to preserve the environment, they want to improve the air, they want to reduce the carbon emissions, they want to reduce gasoline consumption, and yet they're seemingly happy with millions and countless people streaming into the United States, which has the highest per capita greenhouse emission rate in the world. So what that means is an American results or releases more carbon dioxide into the environment than any other person in the world.
The thrust of the point is well taken. It's not quite technically true. That conception that Jeff had there, I think, is a little bit dated. According to Edgar, the emissions database for global atmospheric research, the United States comes in at 16th globally in terms of per capita emissions. There are several Middle Eastern countries that come in front of the United States. As far as developed countries, also Canada, Russia, and Australia come in front of the United States. But the countries with higher per capita emissions than the United States, none of them are sending large numbers of migrants into the United States. And so the point stands that the countries that are sending their best to the United States are countries where per capita emissions are lower, much lower on average. I do think that, and this might grind Jeff's gears a little bit, I generally think of environmentalism as very much a luxury belief, and the type of people who hold it, they don't make any sacrifices of their own. In fact, someone who is not at all a self-described environmentalist and someone who is a person of means, but for personal preference reasons, has a very low carbon footprint, much lower than I could have. And I don't have a low footprint for environmental reasons, but a lot of self-professed environmentalists I know in my life are responsible for far more emissions than I am. As we've mentioned, well, we already alluded to previously in this episode, and we've mentioned multiple times when we've talked about topics that touch on this question of environmentalism, by far the biggest thing that contemporary Westerners can do to reduce carbon emissions is not to take air travel. Air travel is by far the largest polluter per capita, per mile traveled in the world, and it's not even close. And so cutting all unnecessary commercial air travel would drastically reduce non-manufacturing based carbon emissions. And yet some of the best known environmentalists in the world, celebrities like Leonardo DiCaprio, have no problem taking private jets, multiple flights from one end of the globe to another just to attend multiple parties in the span of a week, creating more carbon emissions than entire counties, the populations in entire flyover counties will in their entire lives.
And we mentioned Dave Matthews Band earlier. He is historically, the band has focused a lot on environmental issues, and yet the amount of carbon emissions produced by holding a summer tour is astronomical, surely. And yet Dave Matthews has no problem continuing to tour all over the country, all over the world.
The mecca for Dave Matthews Band fans is the 3 nights that the band plays each year at the Gorge in central Washington, a little town of George, Washington, that has nowhere near the infrastructure to support the pilgrimage that fans make. And so it is all of the emissions of any concert in a major urban area multiplied by tens of thousands of people driving an extra hour from any population center after flying in from all over the country to the West Coast to listen to live music. If that's not an expression of a luxury belief, given the putative environmental degradation that is caused by it, I don't know what is. And I say that in terms of looking at the standards that self-described environmentalists lay out. I'm not an adherent to those. I think it is a pretty handy proxy for human flourishing. A measure of that is the abundance and reliability of cheap energy. I think there is scarcely anything that is a better proxy for human material well-being than access to that. But by their own standards, they are creating totally voluntary little environmental catastrophes just for their own hedonistic pleasure. Nearly a decade on from the Russia collusion and election interference hoax being fully exposed as totally fraudulent opposition research carried by an incredulous, mendacious corporate media. A decade on from that, we have polling from The Economist YouGov asking respondents, quote, "Do you believe that Russia interfered with the 2016 U.S. presidential election?" unquote. Among Harris voters, 68% say yes. So more than 2 in 3 Kamala Harris voters in the 2024 election believe that Russia interfered in the 2016 election. And of those 68%, 64% of that 68% believe that said Russian interference, quote, affected the outcome of the election, unquote. And so that is about, do the math there, that's about 45%. So just under half of all Harris voters believe that the putative Russian interference in the 2016 election affected the outcome. And of course, in a winner-take-all electoral college system, the only way to affect an outcome is to have the candidate who would have otherwise won end up losing. And so we can see here is in 2025, nearly half of Democratic voters think that Russia effectively stole the 2016 presidential election. They think that today.
While I share Ness's perspective on Russiagate being one of the biggest hoaxes of my lifetime, I am not as surprised by the findings of this poll. And at the risk of being overly semantic, I just think there are a lot of problems with how this poll is worded. I think it's possible to answer in the affirmative to both those questions while still believing that the Russiagate was a huge hoax. I would agree that Russia affected the 2016 election by their efforts, meaning that if not for the actions of Russia, the election results in the United States would have been different and probably marginally different, maybe not significantly different, but I don't think it's unreasonable to think that, I can say unequivocally the United States engages in election interference regularly all over the world, and I don't see any reason on the face of it why Russia wouldn't do the same. The only limiting factor, I suppose, would be resources and ability, but I think that if you were Vladimir Putin or high-ranking Russian officials in 2015, 2016, and you're looking at a binary choice between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, I think it's pretty obvious, at least in my mind, that Vladimir Putin would have preferred Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton had been very hostile towards Russia, essentially her whole career, and Donald Trump at least had appeared to be less hostile to Russia and willing to make a deal and open-minded to improving the relationship between Russia and the United States, while Hillary Clinton didn't. And so I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility. I think it's likely that Putin would have devoted some amount of resources to sowing chaos and disinformation just to make Americans generally distrustful of the legitimacy of the system altogether. And also I could believe that he would work to disseminate misinformation, making Hillary Clinton look bad, making her look sick or unhealthy or generally unfit to hold office. But to be clear, I'm not saying that Russia was the deciding factor, and that if they had or had not acted, that Hillary Clinton would have won or Donald Trump would have won or anything like that. But I think if I had to answer the question, did Russia interfere, I guess it really just comes down to what is meant by the word interfere. I guess it would be, I'm trying to think what the average American would think when they heard that term in this context. I would guess that it would mean Russia acted improperly or broke the rules of how an election is supposed to be run.
Far be it from me to take from inside the bureaucratic state what the intelligence agencies tell us, but the current DNI, Tulsi Gabbard, reports that the intelligence that the FBI and the CIA had in 2016 is that Putin was totally ambivalent about the 2016 presidential outcome. There are pros and cons from a Russian perspective in terms of having Trump or Hillary Clinton win. Clinton had become certainly more hawkish after leaving her Secretary of State position in the Obama administration. But in the 90s and the aughts, Hillary Clinton was not at all a Russian hawk. And the Republican Party, historically, has been much more hawkish towards Russia, not just during the Cold War, but after its conclusion as well. And so the calculation that Putin would be making presumably would be, Trump is sounding a different tune, but is he going to have control of his administration? And given Putin's understanding of the bureaucratic state, I would assume that he was savvy enough to believe that Trump would be stymied and that he would be buffaloed. And I think to a large extent that was correct. I think without the accusations about the Russia collusion hoax, there might not be effective American proxy support for Ukraine in a war with Russia. I think another thing that I would put some pressure on is to continue the discussion of what Jeff was saying about what the word affect means, what the phrase affecting the election means in this context. If it's simply changing vote totals, well, then if a single vote total changes, yes, I suppose in some way it does affect the election. But in terms of who assumes the presidency and who doesn't, of shifting votes one way or another, it doesn't affect the outcome of who wins, doesn't affect it in any meaningful way. And I think the vernacular insinuation of the phrase interference in the election implies that something illegal was done. And of course, foreign entities are protected in terms of being able to express an opinion about another country's election outcome or political operations. That is effectively, that's what foreign policy is. And as Jeff said, the United States, by that definition, interferes, well, we know interferes in dozens of countries' elections on an annual basis, and probably you would be hard-pressed to find a single election if you were able to fully trace funding through USAID and the NGOs that it supports and CIA cutouts. There's probably not a single election, at least a national level election anywhere on the planet, that the United States doesn't interfere in by that definition. And if interference is just conceived of meaning expressing a preference or campaigning and maybe playing fast and loose with the truth, well, of course, every Democratic and every Republican politician and everyone who campaigns for them and canvasses for them does that on a regular basis. Political ads are hardly an attempt at an objective description of the various candidate stances. They are never presented in that way. There's scarcely a political ad that you can't take an angle where you could make the argument that it is misinformation or disinformation, or at the very least skewed and presented in a way that does not have truth as the highest value. One of the reasons I think it's worth pointing this out is that there is an insinuation, still an accusation made, that MAGA were election denialists in 2020. That's an assertion many Democrats would make and will still make. And it's worth correspondingly noting that many Democrats, by the same token, were election denialists about 2016. Objectively, I think the MAGA side of the argument comes off looking better here, because one of the underlying MAGA premises is that the whole system is corrupt and needs to be heavily reformed, if not drained entirely and refilled from the ground up. But in both cases, just depending on the election, we have large swaths of the opposition believing that American elections do effectively lack integrity. And I think this dovetails nicely with what we were talking about previously in terms of how modern populations, how they have the American founders and cultural icons like Charles Darwin presented to them, where the emphasis is not on the truth of a matter, but instead in how it can be utilized to push forward the interests of those who are pointing it out. To be more precise, the concern that both Democrats and Republicans, at least large numbers of voters in America, and not just in America, but in democracies across the world, the important part is not the alleged integrity of the democratic process, whatever that means exactly. The important part is, does my preferred person win or not? And when it comes to evaluating certain claims, certain assertions, the important thing is not the veracity or lack thereof of the claims, but do these claims help or hurt my interests in this moment? Our democracy is sacred when I get the outcome that I want, and our democracy is broken and in need of desperate repair when things don't go my way. Though we were talking about differences in human populations previously, that characteristic is something that the vast majority of humans across cultures and belief systems are similar on. And that'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.